Hey guys, Deluxeteer here. Today I wanted to make a video showing you how to set up a workflow so that you can compile Sassy Materialize files using Gulp 4. I want to specify that we're going to be working with Materialize version 1.0.0 and that with this workflow you can compile the Sass files that are provided on Materialize's website. And they don't tell you exactly how to work with them, especially if you're a little more of a beginner and you are kind of unfamiliar with Sass and how to work with these files. So I made this video to show you how you can set up a task runner, which is going to be Gulp 4, to automatically compile the SCSS files for you, and as also to concatenate the modularized JavaScript files they have into a single minified file. So as you can see here, I have the code up on my GitHub, which I will include the link to in my video description. That way you can just clone the repo, run the commands that I have specified in the README, and then you can take your customized files and put them in whatever project you want. I wanted to preface that in this video that I'm assuming you already know a little bit about Materialize, about how some of the components work. And we're not going to touch on any particular components per se, but it's good to know about what the framework is. I'm also assuming you know a little bit of JavaScript and are somewhat familiar with Gulp in general. Maybe you've used Gulp 3.9 and earlier. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the difference with Gulp 4 in this video. But first off, I'll just download this repo and show you how to run it and demonstrate how you can do some changes to the source code, and that will show up in your minified files. So first I'm going to do this, which is git clone. I'm going to copy the link to the Git repo. I'm on Windows, so I use git bash for my command line. So I'm going to go into my desktop and say git clone and that link I copied. Now I have my directory. I'm going to open it up in VS Code, which is a very awesome code editor. I recommend it to anyone. So one way to do that is to change directory into the directory in question, and then say code dot meaning current directory. That will open up your directory as a project in VS Code. I'll stop using git bash because I actually like the integrated terminal for Windows. In general, if you want to open it up, you go to View Terminal, and it'll be open. If you're on Windows, it'll default to PowerShell. I have it set up so it's configured to git bash. There's some tutorials you can see online on YouTube and elsewhere about how to do this. So I won't be going over that, but right now I'm going to install all the dependencies. I'm also assuming you know a little bit about npm in this project, so I won't be touching on too many things, but you have to install the dependencies. So I'm going to say npm install. Okay, now once all the dependencies are installed, you can take a look at some of the files we have here in our directory. So of course we have our package.json file, which has listed all the dependencies. I'm going to close this terminal for now. It has all the dependencies we need and some scripts to get us going. I'll quickly get to the scripts in just a second. We have our gulp file, which is going to talk about all the tasks we want to run on it. We have Babel as one of our dependencies, so we have a babelrc file. And we have our source file directory, which has our Sass files and our JavaScript files. These are taken from the Materialize website, so you can download them and put them into your source folder, but this project already has them here. Then we have our dist directory, which has index.html and also has our official directory as well, and that contains downloads from the Materialize website. So those are the official CSS and JavaScript files, which you can use to compare with your custom version of Materialize. I think it's a handy reference, so I have them there. And we have our index.html file, which will have a bunch of different components of Materialize for you to test. You can use whatever you want to test. I just have those components in there as an example, but I'll show more of those later. Going back to the package.json file, we have 4 scripts you can run. The one that's the default is build, and what that does is it's going to compile the Sass files, it's going to concatenate the JavaScript files, put them all in the dist folder, and then it will automatically start up a small server which will serve up all your static files in the dist folder using a npm plugin called BrowserSync, which is a very good plugin module. And it will watch for any changes you make in your Sass and JavaScript files, as well as your index.html. So I'll actually just do that. So I'll open up the terminal again, and I'm going to say npm run build. That should compile the Sass files. You should see it coming up soon. Yep, there we go. That's our task to compile the Sass files, the task to concatenate the JavaScript files, and then it's going to boot up the server. It does take a little bit of time to compile the JavaScript files. I think it's because I'm screen recording as well. It's usually 8 seconds for me, but since I'm screen recording, it takes a little bit more time. And everything seems to be working. So this is my test page with a bunch of different components that I've taken from the Materialize documentation site. And it's just testing a bunch of different things. Even have JavaScript components like the carousel and the modal, so it works fine. Cool thing to note is that we have a module called Gulp source maps, so that you can know exactly where in your source files certain CSS rules are coming from. So if you right click on anything on the page and hit inspect, so I picked, let's pick the card. So you can use this selector here, then click on the card. You can see in the style section, the rules are coming from this SCSS file at this line. So if I go to that file and source Sass components, cards.scss, let me close this. On line 142, you should find that CSS rule, card content. It's probably a nested rule. Yeah, it is. See, you can see it's card, and then you can nest rules in Sass or SCSS. So it's indeed the same rule that you see here, padding and border radius. Yep. So this is really handy. And just to also demonstrate that this is working properly and that you can make some custom changes, I will change the theme colors of the framework we have here. And to do that, you can go to variables.scss. It's within the components folder. Scroll down a bit till you see primary color and secondary color. These variables will store whatever colors you need. And you can see some of the colors they have by default in Materialize if you go to, I believe, color variables. Yeah, so you can see Materialize red, pink, purple, deep purple, etc. So you can use these colors in the variables file. And you can add your own custom ones in that previous file as well, but just to demonstrate, I'm going to change the primary color to deep purple, and then change the secondary color to orange. Let me open up the terminal again so you can see. Once I hit save, it should recompile the Sass files, and then after that it should reload the browser automatically. So hit save. The task is running now. It's recompiling the Sassy CSS files. And now browser sync has refreshed the page. As you can see, it is now purple, the primary color, and the secondary colors are now orange. So from here you can add your own custom components, modify the pre-existing ones, do whatever you want. I'll just stop this server, kill it. So that's that. Now I'm gonna build it from scratch so you can see how it works and get a better understanding about how this setup works as well. But at this point, if you just want to use the code, then by all means use it. If you see any mistakes in it, any optimizations that you think could be better, please leave a comment in the video. I would appreciate that. You can even send a pull request on the GitHub page as well. And yeah, so now I'm going to make it from scratch. So I'm just going to exit out of here, close this down, and then delete my original file. Alright, so I deleted the folder now I'm ready to start from scratch. I'm just going to tell you that I'm going to be copying and pasting a lot of code and then talking about it, because typing it out, I realized it just makes the video too long. So I'm just going to do that instead, for some of the parts at least. So now I'm going to make a new directory and call it Sassy Materialize. If you want to open it up in VS Code, another way instead of using that command line version is just to drag your directory onto a shortcut of VS Code. Alright, so now we have our empty directory. Since we're going to be using npm packages, it's important to initialize a package.json file. So let's go to View, Terminal. Use our integrated terminal again. And we're going to say npm init. If you just want the default options, you can, I believe you can use -y. That should just give you everything by default. Yeah. So there's your default package.json file. Good. The next step is to create the basic file structure. So we'll just add a folder called dist, and we'll add our source folder as well. And it's up to you guys, but I talked about earlier making a subdirectory called official, which will hold the official versions of Materialize, which you can compare with your custom build. I think this would be useful, so I'll put that there. Next, we'll download the official files from the Materialize website. So you can go to materializecss.com, click on Getting Started, and scroll down so you can download the Sass files. And then I would refresh the page and then download the static files here as well. Okay, so those are downloaded. And I don't know why I can't really drag and drop folders into the VS Code panel, but I just have to open up another Explorer. So I'll do that. Anyway, in the downloads folder, so we have a zip file that has source in it in the name. That is going to be your Sass and JavaScript files. And that's what we need to put in our source folder. So I'm going to go to our source folder, then drag and drop our Sass and JavaScript files. Similarly, I'm going to go back into my downloads folder, go into the other file we downloaded, then copy the production static files into our official directory. So I'll go back to our dist official, and then I'm going to take the unminified version of our CSS and JavaScript files, because you want to be able to read the production versions, I'm assuming, if you want to compare and contrast. So I'll take the unminified versions and put them there. Good. So if we go back to our code editor, everything should be there. Good. Okay. After that, we want to make our index.html file in the dist folder. I'll put this away. So I'm going to say index.html. This is what our server is going to look for when it starts up. When I started making this page, I took the default HTML setup they have here on the downloads page, and you can do that. And I made some modifications from there. It's going to be too long for me to type up everything, so I'm just going to go into my GitHub and then copy and paste what I have in my GitHub here for index.html. And then I'm just going to quickly talk about what I did in it compared to the one they have on Materialize's website. Okay. So what I did instead, what I did to this one is I added Google fonts to it. That's completely optional, but I added Roboto. You can just go to fonts.google.com. And then it'll show you a bunch of different fonts you can pick. Roboto is the first one, so you can hit plus. Then go to the drop down and then copy this link tag that they provide you. And then paste it in to your index.html. And then after that, I have two other link tags, one for the official version for testing purposes, and then one for a custom build. I commented out the official version, and I left uncommented out the compiled version, which we will have. And make sure that the path looks like this. We don't have a CSS directory in our dist folder. That's because when we build our CSS and JavaScript files, our task runner, Gulp 4, is going to automatically create those directories for us if they don't already exist. And it's going to be named the same way, materialize.min.css, as with the production versions of the minified files would be. So this is the CSS part. And then for our body, you can put whatever Materialize components you want to test here. I took a bunch from the documentation and pasted it in just to see if it basically works out at first. And you're more than welcome to copy the markup I have on my GitHub page if you want, but you can really put any Materialize stuff here you want. I'm assuming if you're customizing your Materialize, you'd probably want to put your customized components here as well. Then towards the bottom, I did the same thing with the JavaScript as I did with the CSS files. So I had two script tags, one for the official and one for the unofficial version, commented and uncommented out accordingly. And if you know anything about Materialize, you'd probably know that if you have any components on your page that has JavaScript in it, it won't run out of the box. You have to initialize it when it's when your page is loaded. And in order to a quick way to initialize them without having to do it individually is just to create another script tag and to run this function here, M.AutoInit. This function will automatically initialize all of your JavaScript Materialize components automatically. The only catch is you can't put any options. You can't pass in any options into the init for any particular component. You would have to initialize it individually then. Okay. I hope that makes sense. So now that our index.html file is done, we're going to create a .getignore file, because I'm assuming you probably want to push up your version to this workflow to GitHub or some other place, and that's fine. So I'm going to make a .getignore file. Now it's important, since this is a NPM project, that you need to ignore certain things that are standard. So you want to ignore the node modules folder, because you can always just download those again when you have NPM. And pushing those up will take up a lot of space, so that's unnecessary. Another thing you want to ignore is package-lock.json. And the other two things you want to ignore is your compiled JavaScript and CSS files, because you could always just build that again with your workflow, right? So there's no sense in pushing those up to GitHub or wherever either. So that's a dist/css, so all those files, and dist/js. Ideally, it's just going to be your minify files in each of these directories, but who needs empty directories anyway at this point? Good. So we have our getignore file, and now when we get into the juicy part, we're going to install our dependencies. I could just type it all out, but it takes some time. I'll just talk about what we're about to install. Should be that. So run npm install and then put the flag --save-dev, so you can save these modules as dev dependencies. And then we're going to install Gulp, our main task runner, which is going to do all this stuff for us. Browser sync, which is the module that has our mini server, which will serve up our static files and reload. And the cool thing about browser sync is that it works across different devices if you use the same URL. And as the name suggests, it will sync the browser across multiple devices that way. So if you have it on your mobile phone and on your desktop, if you scroll on your mobile phone, it will scroll on your desktop version as well. That's pretty cool. Next we have Gulp auto prefixer. This will automatically prefix our CSS rules so that we can get more cross-browser compatibility, which is paramount with web development. Next we need Gulp Babel. because we need to transpile a lot of the ES6 code in the JavaScript files to older versions. So there's more browser compatibility, like with browsers like IE, and you also need it because of one of the other modules we have, Gulp Uglify, which cannot read ES6 code. Now we also have Gulp Concat, which is going to take our multiple JavaScript files in the source folder, these guys, and then it's going to concatenate it into a single JavaScript file. And if you have less files to call on, you can make less server requests, which will then enhance the performance of your site. We have also Gulp Rename, which is just going to rename the final CSS file to materialize.min.css. This is completely optional if you don't want to rename your file. It kind of bugs me that I can't put the min in there, so I put this module in there, but it's up to you. Then we also have Gulp Sass, which will compile our SCSS files into a single minified CSS file for us. We have Gulp Source Maps, which I kind of mentioned earlier, but it will allow us to trace our CSS rules to the specific SCSS files that they came from. And that's extremely useful for debugging, because if we didn't have that, it would just reference the minified CSS file that we have in our dist folder, and that's not very helpful. And then the final module is Gulp Uglify, which is going to minify our concated JavaScript file. And those are all the packages. So I'll just let those download. Okay, so now once all the packages are downloaded, I just also want to mention that you can just delete this bin folder. We don't need any of these binaries because we have all the files that we already need, so you can delete that bin directory. Right? Okay. And then also we want to install some plugins, because as some of you might know about Babel, it doesn't actually work out of the box. You need to specify some presets or plugins that you need to specify what type of things, what kind of JavaScript code you want to transpile. And if you want to know which ones we are using for this project, you can actually find out by, you can figure out which ones you can use for this project by going to Materialize, their GitHub page. And for compiling the code for their website and for Materialize, they also use a task runner. It's another one called grunt.js, and it uses a file called gruntfile.js, which tells Grunt what tasks to run and what to do and how to go about doing it. So on this file, if you search for Babel, you can see the exact ES6 code that they're transpiling. So they're doing arrow functions, block scoping, classes, template literals, and the super function and object constructors. So we're going to be installing these plugins as well and using these, as well as the Babel core. So I also copied this and pasted that in here. You can pause this video and then copy what's written here. Okay, great. So now our Babel plugins are installed. If you want to learn more about Babel and how these plugins work and all these other things about Babel, I suggest going on to the docs page for Babel and learning more from there. I won't really go into the specifics because I don't think I can explain it that well. But I will say that anytime you're using Babel, you need to create a babel.rc file in your root folder, and that will tell Babel what presets and what plugins to use. So we're going to do that here. I'm going to say, I think it's still in that other directory. That's kind of my gripe with VS Code sometimes. Yeah, .babel rc, and it kind of takes in something that looks like a JSON. Looks like JSON data, but we're going to put in plugins, and then you're going to take an array of all the plugins that we're going to copy, or we're going to use. So we can copy what we have in our terminal, and then paste this in and format it accordingly. I'll be back when I'm done formatting it. Alright guys, just to make sure, just delete the Babel core part, because we obviously using plugins in the plugin array, and also strip off the version number in case you're copying it and pasting in from the terminal like how I did. Good. So we have that. Now we will make the Gulp file, which is similar to the grunt file we saw earlier on the Materialize's GitHub. This tells Gulp what the tasks are and what they will do. So gulpfile.js is what we need. And close this. Close this as well. Alright, again, to save time, I'm just going to copy and paste what I have in my GitHub and then talk about what's going on. So I'll go with here, gulpfile.js. Alright, and paste this in. Alright, I'll explain the code. So basically you want to import, as with any npm module, you need to import it. You can use require and then specify the name of the module and then put it into a variable. So I did that with Gulp, browser sync, source maps, Sass, auto prefixer, rename, Babel, concat, and uglify. So basically all the modules that we imported on that first npm install command. And also I just want to point out, make sure that you create the browser sync object with .create after you require it, and it'll be stored into this variable. Next we have this JavaScript files array, which contains a specific order of JavaScript files to concatenate. As you can see, it's a little different because, at least in my Explorer, they're in alphabetical order. And this is important because, as you might know, in JavaScript, the order of precedence, there's an order of precedence. The order matters. So you need to concatenate the JavaScript files in a certain order so nothing breaks. And you might be wondering, how do I know that it's this order and in this way? Well, again, in the grunt file on Materialize's GitHub, if you go search for concat, for their concat task, you'll see, lo and behold, all the JavaScript files in the order that they compile it. So this is what I would recommend. I would go here and copy the entire array that they have here. And if you're just making up your own custom components that uses some special JavaScript, then you would probably append it to this array. So that's what I did here. I just copied that array here. And you might have guessed also, if you look in our directory, that the paths are incorrect because our Gulp file isn't the root, and we need to go to source, and then we're able to access JS/, whatever the components are. So you can just use a one-liner of JavaScript code. So what I did is I use array.map, which will run a function that will modify each element in the array, in this case each file path. And then after that, map will return a new array of these modified elements, which I reassigned back into JS files. But the function that's modifying the each element of the array, which I called file in the parameter, what it does, it's basically using template literals. So you just use backticks, then put in whatever values you would normally use in a string. So I just say source slash, and then when you want to use a variable, you use $ curly brace and then the file name, the variable, and that will automatically replace it with whatever value stored in that variable. Very useful feature for ES6. Okay, now we're going to talk about the tasks that we have available. So this is a little different from Gulp 3.9 and earlier. In Gulp 4, we see there's something different. So in Gulp 3.9, what you might normally see is you might see gulp.task, then you would specify the path to the files that you're going to use, and then you would run a callback function doing whatever, right? But it's a little different in Gulp 4. So instead of doing that, all the tasks are basically functions. So you'd use function, call it whatever you want. So it's a task name. Then you do all your task stuff here, and you specify all your task stuff, and then once you're done, you would export it so that way it's accessible in the command line or whatever script you're using. So you'd say exports dot whatever you want to call it in your scripts. So, and then you would assign it to whatever your task name here is in the file. Common sense wise, you would just use the same name. So it's a task name exports.task name equals task name. So that way, when I'm in my command line, I can say gulp task name, and then it will run this function. If I change this to something else, like another name, then I would have to say gulp another name, and that will run this, which is this guy. I hope that makes sense. But for common sense sake, just use the same name for simplicity. And that's kind of the most noticeable difference between Gulp 4 and earlier versions. There's something else also. I'll get to that at the end of this file. But anyway, so we're going to do our first task of compiling the Sass files. So we're going to use SCSS. That's what I named my task. So what we're going to do is a multi-line return statement. So you just do return parentheses, then you put in whatever things you want to return. And it's going to be this whole line of tasks we're going to return. So we're going to return, what we do in Gulp is we first specify the source. So we say gulp.source, and it takes in an array of paths of files you want to target. We just want to target all the Sass files. So we say source slash Sass slash star.scss. Now, this path is only going to target this file here, materialize.scss, but that's sufficient because Materialize structured their Sass files, their SCSS files, in such a way that this file is basically a table of contents of all the other components. So when you target this file, you're also going to target all the other files that it's importing. So that's very handy. So you don't have to recursively go down, like you will have to see, like we will do later, but you'll see. After you get your source down, you want to pipe in the next module to process those files. So you say .pipe, and then we're going to pass in our module of source maps. And then according to the source maps documentation for get source maps, you need to initialize source maps at the beginning of your tasks and then write it at the end of your task. So I did source map.init and then passed in these options. Load maps equals true, and then large file equals true, because the compiled file could potentially be very big. So we want to put in this option. After that, we're going to do another pipe, and we're going to process it further by calling on the Sass module that we imported. And that's going to take all of our SCSS files that we targeted, and then it's going to compile it into a single minified CSS file. It's going to be minified because we pass in this option of output style to be compressed. If you think there's an error in your compiled CSS file and you want to see what's in it, then you can just change this to expanded. That will make it more readable and you can see what's going on. But I'm just going to leave it as compressed. And with the Sass module, after this parenthesis, right after the Sass function, you can run .on and then catch any errors that may come up. So you say .on and then say error, and then you can output the error log. So you say sass.log error. After we compiled our Sass files, we want to prefix our new CSS file. So we're going to pipe in our auto prefixer, and we're going to pass in these options to target what versions and what browsers we want to target with our auto prefixers. You can choose what you want. You can look at the documentation for more specifics, but I copied the one used in the grunt file for their auto prefixer. So if you search for auto prefixer, they use the same, more or less the same module for their grunt, and then they passed in these options. So I use the same ones as them. After that, I'm going to pipe in our rename module. I just wanted to rename it to materialize.min.css. And since we're pretty much at the end of our task, I have to write with source maps, so we pipe in source maps.write. And then with pretty much all tasks, if you want to store your output for your task, you would pipe in your gulp.dest for destination, and that will take your final CSS file and put it in whatever path you specify there. And I put it in dist/CSS. And this gulp.dest, if it doesn't find a directory that you specify, it will automatically create a new one for you. So we don't have to make one manually. And that's the Sass task. So we also have the JavaScript task. This is kind of similar, where it's going to concatenate the files and minify it. So it's kind of the same idea. Call this JS. We specify a source. We went through all the trouble of specifying order, so we'll use the variable we use that stores an array of all those paths. So I'm using that. I'm also going to be using source maps again, so I'll use source map.init. And then after that, I'm going to pipe in Babel. And since we already use all the configurations in Babel RC, we have that file. We just need to call Babel here, and that's all you need to do. After that, we're going to pipe in our concat module. So it's going to take all of our transpiled JavaScript files and concatenate them into one single JS file. And you can name it whatever you want here. And I named it materialize.min.js. And finally, I'm going to minify our concatenated JavaScript file. So I'm going to say pipe, and then I'm going to pipe in our uglify module. So we'll put that there. And then of course we have to write to source maps. So we have to pipe source maps.write. And then since we want to output this to a file, we're going to use pipe, and then we're going to pipe gulp.dest, and we're going to specify dist/js, which again will create a directory if we don't already have a JS directory. Excuse me. Now finally we have this watch task. So this is where we want to initialize browser sync, and this is where we want to serve up our files and watch for any changes that happens to our source code. So that way if there's a change, we can recompile our files and also reload our browser, so we don't have to manually refresh the page. So what we do to initialize our server, our browser sync, is we're going to do browser sync.init, because we already created it up here, right? We created it here and then assigned it here. I'm going to say browser sync.init, and it's going to take in an object of options. We're going to take in server, and then whatever you specify for server is the directory that you're serving files from. And we want to serve up the static files we have in our dist folder, right? So we're going to specify dist. Next, we want to say that we're going to open this up in an external browser, so we say open external, and then we're going to specify the port that we're going to bind it to. We're going to bind this to port 9000 or whatever port that's free for you. Just don't pick a port that's already being used by some other web service. After that, Gulp has some built-in functions in it for watching changes, fortunately. So we want to watch for changes in our Sass file and our JS file and our index.html file. So we have 3 different watch functions for that. So for watch, you specify which files you want to watch for any changes, and then a callback function for it. In this case, we're going to be running tasks whenever these files change, right? So whenever a Sass file changes, we're going to recompile our Sass files and get a new CSS file. And you might have noticed that the path is a little different, right? Because while this is indeed just a table of contents kind of Sass file, it's not sufficient, because you need to watch for changes that happen here, anywhere in your Sass file. Because if you don't look for it recursively, then it's not going to work. It's only going to watch for changes in Materialize.scss. So if you want to watch recursively for all Sass files within subdirectories, you need to do */*star.scss, and that will target all the Sass files, and then it will run the Sass task that we specified. And then we do something similar for the JavaScript. And since it's a flatter structure, we don't have to do recursive checking. It's all already here in the JS folder. You can say all JavaScript files, or star.js, then run the JS task. And now for this last one. So you might be wondering, so it will reload the browser by using browser sync.reload, and it will run that function when there's a change to any of these paths, any of these files. So if there's any change to any HTML file in our dist folder, or any CSS JavaScript file in our dist folder. And you might be wondering why I targeted the dist folder for the JavaScript and CSS files. You might be wondering, why not target the Sass files and the JavaScript files in the source folder? And that's because there's going to be a timing issue. If I was watching for the Sass files and the JavaScript files in the source folder, what's going to happen is that it's going to run these tasks, and then while those tasks are compiling, it's going to reload the browser in the middle of it before the Sass and JavaScript files are done compiling. So what happens is you're going to have new files, but then you have to reload the browser manually to see the changes again, which defeats the purpose of having this. So instead, something a little more intelligent is to watch for changes in your dist folder, because if you make a change in your Sass and if you make a change in your source folder, it's going to reflect in your compiled files, and then this function will see that your compiled files are different now, so then now it can reload the browser, and then everything will run more smoothly, right? So that's why we're doing it that way. And like I showed earlier, you have to export your tasks to make them available on the command line or in some script. Excuse me. So I just simply exported them, giving them the same names as their tasks. And in Gulp, you can set a default task. So if you just run the command Gulp, it will run whatever is assigned to exports.default. And I assigned it to this variable. And now here's another difference in Gulp 4. We have these functions called Gulp Serialize and Gulp Parallel. And we need these functions, right? Because, like I said earlier, timing is important with these tasks. What we want in our workflow is that all the Sass files will compile and then finish. Then all the JavaScript files will compile and then finish. And then once that's done, then we can serve up the browser and then watch for any changes to our files. And we want it in this order, sequentially. So that's why we have the series function, because the series function will take whatever tasks you put into it and run them sequentially in order that you in the order that you specify them in. And it will only move on to the next one until the first one's complete, from what I understand. Parallel, on the other hand, it doesn't wait. It runs all the tasks you specify in it at the same time, which could be useful for some purposes, but we need to run these sequentially if you want the timing to work out. So that's it. That's our entire workflow. So at this point, if you open up the terminal, view terminal. Oh, my apologies. We have to make the last thing we have to do is just go into our package.json file, then write our npm scripts. Just for simplicity, it's optional. I like doing it because I just find it nicer. So we set up our default Gulp task so that it will automatically compile the Sass files, the JavaScript files, and then run browser sync. So that's our default task, so we just say Gulp for it. And I'm assigning that as under build, under the build script. Next, if you just want to compile the Sass files, I'll make a script called Sass, called CSS, and you would run the command Gulp SCSS. For concatenating and compiling just the JavaScript, you can just do JS and then do Gulp JS. It'll run that task. And if you already built everything and you just want to run the server and run browser sync, then you can make a watch script and call it watch, and then you just run the command Gulp watch. That'll run the watch task. Save. Now everything should work. So if we go to view terminal, we say npm run build, everything should work properly. Okay. It seems to be working. Okay. And it looks like it's working. Let me double check. Is this actually our files? Yep. Materialized. Yep, it's our files it's using. See, yep. Created those directories for us, as you can see, with those files. Everything seems to be working in order. JavaScript is working fine. I do that thing with the source maps if it's working. Yep, it's there. If you don't see it, another thing I should have mentioned earlier is you can go to your DevTools and then go to Settings. If you're using Chrome, at least, you can go to Preferences, scroll down to Sources, and then make sure Enable CSS Source Maps is checked. So that way you can see it. But yeah. So that's how the workflow works. If you have any questions, any concerns, any comments, please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please give this video a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it, and it'd be helpful so that more people can see this video if they need help with this. And also, again, if you find any corrections or optimizations, you can also send me a pull request on my GitHub repo, which will again be in the description of this video. And that's it.